So this talk marks the beginning of a whole series of talks, this kind of last 1/3 of the course, where we're looking at contemporary practice. What are ideas and theories that are stimulating practice right of our time? We're going to be looking at architects who have a significant body of work that is in the 21st century, but that certainly are creating an influence for architecture that's being produced now. And the first of these we're going to look at is Zaha Hadid. Zaha Hadid certainly is a major presence in architecture. Actually died a short time ago, but her legacy will live on, and her firm is living on as we speak. But she broke many, many barriers. Certainly, she's the first really dominant female architect in the 21st century, just worldwide influence, and really sort of burst on the scene in a unique way, paving a role for women architects. She also is the first kind of Arab Muslim architect to have that kind of influence and status and power in architecture. But way, way more important than that, she has her own unique perspective on what architecture should be. She sees architecture as art, and she's an artist, and she's producing works of art in the medium of architecture. So Zaha Hadid was born in 1950 in Baghdad in Iraq. Her father was a very wealthy industrialist from Mosul, very, very influential man in Iraq. He was one of the founders of the National Democratic Party. And in 1958, they had a coup d'etat, and they deposed the monarch, longstanding monarch of Iraq, and started a democratic government in Iraq. So her father was an incredible rebellious guy. He became the Minister of Finance in that government that actually didn't last that long and was yet again deposed, and another government took over. But her father continued to be a very influential man in Iraqi politics and in the economy of Iraq. Her mother was also a very prominent figure. She was an artist. She was also from Mosul. And had quite a reputation of her own. And then Zaha Hadid's brother was also a very influential guy in Iraq. He was quite an Arab scholar and very involved in political affairs for his life as well. So she was from this very elite, very privileged, very influential family. And she was sent to private school, boarding schools, mostly in England and in Switzerland. There was a lot of turmoil going on in Iraq, so it was deemed more appropriate for her to leave the country and be educated at these boarding schools. And then when she graduated from high school, she went on to college at the American University in Beirut, which is a phenomenally good university in Lebanon. Probably one of the most outstanding universities in the Middle East. She studied mathematics there, was a star student, and very interested in technical things. Then, toward the end of her time as an undergraduate, she decided she wanted to become an architect. And it was actually a friend of her brother's who convinced her that the only place to go would be the Architectural Association in London, the AA. If you remember back to the Rem Koolhaas talks, that's where Rem Koolhaas went to school. And it was this really amazing period at the AA. Alvin Boyarsky was the director still, and it was a real center for architectural ideas at the AA. At the AA, you would study in a particular cluster. She kind of got in the wrong cluster at the beginning and was not fitting in and doing that well. But she could see over there that Rem Koolhaas was now teaching at the AA, and his partner at OMA, Elias Angelis, was also teaching with him at the AA. And she was looking over there and thinking, those guys are doing the work I want to do. So she talks with them, and kind of unusual at the AA, she moved to another cluster within the AA and began to study with Rem Koolhaas and Elia Zangelis. And she was an absolutely star student. Zangelis described her as the most outstanding pupil he'd ever had. He said she was the inventor of 89 degrees. Nothing was ever at 90 degrees. She had her own spectacular vision of things. Rem Koolhaas described her at graduation as a planet in her own orbit. She absolutely, from day one, had her own kind of unique vision of where she was going. She did not care about details at all, how the building might be constructed or functional issues, totally out of her purview. She saw what she was doing very much as art. She didn't do drawings, she did paintings. She called them paintings. And for her graduate project, she did an enormous, very beautiful and colorful painting of her project, which was a hotel that kind of acted as a bridge. And it got spectacular reviews and was kind of the most outstanding work at the AA in her year. So from the very beginning, it was very clear this woman had her own vision, did things her own way, and did it at a very high level. Upon graduation, she went to work for Rem Koolhaas and Elia Zangelis at OMA, moved to Rotterdam, and she worked there for 2 years, from 1977 to 1979, and then decided to go out on her own and have her own practice. And she moved back to London and established her practice in London. Now, it was a very, very unusual practice. She actually did no buildings for 14 years. She didn't build anything in her practice for 14 years. She was very much interested in pursuing these ideas and these notions that she had personally in her head. She entered competitions. She did speculative projects. She was working consistently, but she was not working on projects that were going to get built. And in fact, she was also teaching a good bit at the time. And I would say very much like we've seen in the case of Venturi or Le Corbusier or Rem Koolhaas, this was a period of her working on theory. What do I believe? What do I think? Who am I as an architect? What kind of work do I want to do? And she was experimenting with that. And her teaching was a vehicle for her exploring that as well. She taught many different places. She went back and taught at the AA, her alma mater. Then she taught for several years at Harvard. She taught also at Cambridge University in England. She taught both at the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois in the Midwest. She taught at Columbia in New York. So she was doing these visiting professor stints, but always still having her practice in London. And these projects that she did were an architectural wonder, and they began to be published a lot, even though they were speculative projects. They were published a lot in architectural journals, and she began to get quite a reputation. Then a big break came in 1988. Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley mounted a major show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was called Deconstruction in Architecture. Deconstruction is not a word she's been particularly happy with. Some of the other people who were lumped in that have also not been particularly happy with it. But it was a group of architects that Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley saw as having a new direction that was going to have an influence on the field. So MoMA mounts this big exhibit. All of the other architects have built work, and it's an architecture exhibit. But Zaha Hadid's work is these paintings, these spectacular, gorgeous, colorful paintings, and that was really what she displayed. But it began still to have an influence on the field of architecture. So she's developing her theory, and as we'll see in the next talk, when we look at her work, she's developing a real notion of what kind of building she wants to do. Now there were, significant influences of the era that were having an impact on what Zaha Hadid was doing. I would say there are four things primarily. The first is she was a part of a very rebellious moment in culture. She was very anti-establishment, very against convention. And this was happening all over in the 1960s and 1970s, this kind of complete rejection of everything that had gone before, and a kind of start from scratch reinvention of what culture should be, lifestyle should be, social mores should be, all of those things being reinvented, and a lot of rebelliousness at the time. And for her, it was not, architecture did not come out of function. Architecture did not come out of construction or structure. Architecture was art, and it came kind of full-blown out of a visual expression. So that rebelliousness was in the air and very much a part of culture at the time, and it influenced her thinking. Another thing was this notion of instability and of kind of fragmentation. She certainly knew instability in her own life. Her country, Iraq, had had this tremendous political instability. Then she goes to Beirut to study, and oh my gosh, Beirut is having revolution and instability and fragmentation, and at the same time the Berlin Wall is falling, and all the sort of major power structure like the Soviet Union that people thought was inevitable and there didn't last, now it's all crumbling and falling apart and becoming fragmented. This was something that I think also very much influenced her thinking. A third thing is she certainly was plugged into this postmodern intellectual scene, and these ideas about episodic things being more important than holistic things. Things like ambiguity being more interesting than clarity. Notions that emotion is equally valid to logic. All of those sort of ideas in literature and in film and in other areas of postmodern culture, those are, I think, influencing Zaha Hadid as well. And then the fourth thing, and maybe the most important thing to me, is that she was very plugged into modern art really of the 20th century primarily. And she looked at these artists in the 20th century and she said, this is what I want to learn from. Even back in her student days, she was looking at Kazimir Malevich, the Russian constructivist artist. And a lot of her work was very much based on looking at Malevich. She was looking at artists who had a very strong personal expression, something that came out of their own personality and their own ego in some ways. She was also very interested in these artists that created an identifiable kind of ethos of their work. It had a signature, it had a vocabulary that was particular to them. And that they explored these themes very deeply, and there was a real consistency to the work in the way they explored the same ideas over and over and over again in different ways. That would certainly have been true of Kazimir Malevich, but maybe the artist she admired greatly that was the clearest about this is someone like Piet Mondrian. And Piet Mondrian basically, in his mature career, he took black and white and three primary colors, blue, red, and yellow. And he only worked in black, white, blue, red, and yellow. And he basically did orthogonal compositions of 90 degrees and proportions of rectangles. And he explored that very deeply. We all know what a Mondrian painting looks like. He had his own very clear signature style. And that was the kind of deep exploration that Zaha Hadid admired in artists. Another artist, more contemporary artist she was interested in was Ellsworth Kelly. who again had a very confined vocabulary that he worked in, certain colors, certain shapes that he explored in great finesse through his whole career. And that became what he was known for. So this is a woman who is looking at architecture as a vehicle for developing that kind of artistic vision and that kind of artistic expression. And in the next talk, we'll look at how that took form in buildings.